Well, good morning and welcome once again to Elevenses. It's Wednesday, the 15th of June. It's show number 246, and today's show is actually pre-recorded because today I'm on my way down to Devon to deliver my Science of Being Seen talk to the local IAM group around Exeter Way. So, what have I got for you in today's show? Well, we have a story about the police clamping down on helmet use in Mumbai, how electric motorcycles are actually still banned from the quiet designated roads in parts of Germany. We'll look at the latest on Honda's assistive technology for two-wheelers, and coincidentally, a study came out on a rider alert system for test riders, which actually looks at the sort of the parameters of the bike and how it's handling to alert the rider that they may be about to exceed those parameters. And we'll finish off a fairly quick show today. We'll say goodbye to Honda's very modern classic, the CB400 Super Four, but you may not be familiar with. So settle yourselves down for the next 30 minutes or so. Don't forget, Elevenses goes out on Wednesdays and Sundays. It's normally live, but today's show is a recorded one. So without further ado, let's crack on. We're used to police clampdowns here in the UK. I can recall personally checks on dark visors. I got stopped even though I had a clear one. I got stopped to have my number plate checked even though it was a bog standard regular one. I've been checked for noisy exhausts and I have to hold my hand up. One of those was a little bit on the loud side. That was many years ago. But more recently, they started checking for BS marks on them. And one force was even reportedly pulling up riders for failing to wear high vis and giving riders a ticking off and handing out free ones. Now, here in London, of course, we've had regular interventions aimed at delivery riders recently. And of course, just about anywhere in the country, there are blitzes on nuisance riders riding illegally on off-road bikes in places they shouldn't be. And generally speaking, when you see the stories in the press on those, police seem quite happy if they net sort of a dozen miscreants. But over in Mumbai, in India, the traffic authorities have been clamping down on motorcycle riders and pillions who are not wearing helmets, which are a mandatory requirement over there. Now, riders had apparently previously been reminded that this is a compulsory feature of riding a two-wheeler, powered two-wheeler, whether you are on the front end of it steering it or whether you're taking a ride on the back end of it, and that they would be taking action from Thursday 9th of June. So what is actually a bit of a shocker here is the sheer scale of the police action. Now, Mumbai is a big city and there are a lot of motorcycles on the streets, but no less than 6,271 people were ticketed for the offence of not wearing a helmet on the Thursday alone. And that figure was made up of over 2,300 riders and more than 3,400 passengers. So it does make me wonder quite how many police were actually involved in that scale of operation. So that's from Mumbai to Germany, and in our European neighbour, riders are actually up in arms over the bans that have been imposed on motorcycle use on certain routes. Now, these have been placed on roads often in mountain areas or in touristy areas, and some of them are certain times of day, some of them are certain times during the day. For example, in the most recent case, roads in the Upper Taunus region, that's the general area of northwest Germany, which you'll find includes the Nürburgring, which suggests just why this area might have been targeted. Though some of those roads have been granted temporary closures, preventing motorcycle access. Now, since the original concerns have usually been over noise, rider groups have actually challenged this ban on two-wheelers, which is a blanket ban, arguing that electric motorcycles are not only zero emissions, of course, but also very quiet, and therefore they should not be subject to these road orders. And they based this on the actual traffic order, which defined a motorcycle as a two-wheeled vehicle with a displacement greater than 50 cc's and a maximum speed of greater than 54 kilometers per hour. In other words, not a moped. However, the traffic authority in the district of Hochtaunus responded by saying that the ban made no distinction between a motorcycle with an internal combustion engine and one with an electric motor, since the vehicle type on the registration certificate is still motorcycle. So I can see this one running and running. So don't forget, you are watching a recorded edition of Survival Skills webcast 11s. Do set yourself a reminder if you are here for the first time. The webcast goes out Wednesdays and Sundays at 11. As a rule, occasionally I miss a show when I've got other things happening, and it's normally live. Very occasionally I have to do a recorded show, as I am today. So do join me if you possibly can for these shows. And if you can't catch it live, you can of course watch it on Facebook at any time, or more easily you can find it on my YouTube channel, Survival Skills UK. Okay, so on to the next story. Now, it seems that there is an ongoing relentless drive to equip new vehicles with the ability to drive themselves. And of course, motorcycles haven't escaped this new technology. Now, back in 2017, Honda showed off its what they called rider assistance technology through a concept motorcycle that you may recall could actually balance itself and move at low speeds autonomously. Now, new patents that have been filed by the Japanese manufacturer show that the company is continuing to evolve its rider assistance technology, and this is the bike on which it's all fitted. The system basically combines sensors which monitor parameters like speed, acceleration, and braking, and combines that with information about the surrounds of that bike, which it picks up from cameras, radar, and technology called LiDAR. Now, these inputs are all monitored by computer modules. The bike also has a pressure sensor on the seat. There are pressure sensors on the bar grips themselves and on the foot pegs, which allow the machine to determine the weight distribution and the sitting position of the rider. That also allows the weight of a pillion to be monitored, and that in turn can be fed into the parameters which allow the bike to compensate and to balance with the extra weight of a passenger on the back. Now, the idea of this system is that the rider is still intended to be in overall control of the bike, and the idea is that the technology only actually steps in if and when it's needed. And as it stands, it allows the system to actually take over control of throttle, brakes, and steering. And so that allows the machine to offer technologies such as adaptive cruise control, permanent route assistance. I assume that means actually steering, automatic lane conversion. I'll try and explain that in a moment, and low speed car lane. This one overtakes slow vehicles automatically. So if you're on a multi-lane road, it will assess the situation around and move out to pass that slower car. Now, there are also some safety features built in, of course, not just assistive features. Since motorcycles have the ability to change position in the lane, when riding in groups, the system actually uses a staggered pattern by spacing the motorcycle relative to the bike in front. And this, of course, is just as we would do manually, of course, aimed at maximizing our visibility and also opening up a bigger gap for braking. Now, the assistive technology is also said to be able to stop in and prevent accidents. An interesting one is that when the bike is being approached from behind by a faster vehicle, it appears that the bike will then accelerate and on a multi-lane road will move to another lane into an empty space, obviously, to allow the vehicle behind to pass. The steering is using a same what they call magnetostrictive torque sensor on the headstock, which is very similar to the system that's also being worked on by Yamaha, which you may remember I mentioned a couple of months ago. So this monitors the rider input at the steering, and the article says provides help when needed. So presumably, if the system decides you're not actually steering aggressively enough, it'll actually add some extra steering input to get the bike to change direction more quickly. And finally, the bike also allows the sort of the talk between vehicle system via a short range system, which allows the bike to communicate with other nearby vehicles, and ultimately it would allow it to communicate with things like smart traffic lights as well. So all in all, throw in GPS communication with a phone and that kind of thing, and you get an overview of what Honda have been working on. And as you'll see, it pretty much brings the bike into line with the sort of semi-autonomous features that you'd be finding on top of the range cars. In fact, some of the Honda tech appears to be shared with Honda four-wheelers. Now, what bothers me most about this is that the rider of a motorcycle, unlike a car driver who is seat belted in, is not actually tethered to the vehicle. You know, if you think about sitting in the seat of a modern vehicle, you're actually quite snugly supported by the seat itself. You're not sat on a sort of a plank, which is effectively what you are with a motorcycle. So if you've ever been passenger on a bike where the rider makes a slightly unexpected move, braking, steering, accelerating, you'll know exactly what I mean. Now, many years ago, I have a personal story here. I actually fell off the back of a motorcycle when the rider suddenly nailed it from a standstill. I was still turned around and looking over my shoulder, talking to some buddies at the roadside. And I just went straight off the back. So, I mean, how they laughed and how I smarted. I really worry what will happen to a rider if the bike actually takes control and changes speed or direction unexpectedly. I'm struggling to see how the system can apply that sort of sudden change of direction or speed if the rider is not actually secured to the bike. I don't honestly think that holding onto the handlebars or keeping your feet on the foot pegs is good enough. There is one bit of good news, though, if like me, you're not a fan of this kind of intervention. With the very likely addition of adaptive speed control to more and more models in the very, very near future, it's already appearing on some bikes, of course. I don't see this appearing on motorcycles in the immediate future. This is still very much a concept. So for the time being, we can still get on with riding our own motorcycle. Now, if you do enjoy the show, don't forget you can pop over to my coffee page. You can support me over there. Price for coffee gets you access to 800 odd better biking articles for a month. And if you become a regular supporter, you not only get access to all those for as long as you're supporting me, but you also open up articles on many other different topics. Lots of material there. I'm still putting stuff up from the Facebook archives. Now, coincidentally, I also found a paper online which was entitled, the snappy title, Automatic Maneuver and Fall Detection for Motorcycle Test Drives on Proving Grounds. And as the paper goes on to explain, before newly developed vehicles and vehicle components are approved for use on public roads, they're often tested on special sites. Motorbike test riders in particular are exposed to a considerable risk of accidents. So the aim of this project is actually to monitor the safety related parameters of the test machines. So that includes things like collision alerts to make sure that the motorcycles are actually going to hit things, to monitor maximum speed, and what's termed direction of travel specifications, which I suspect means monitoring how the bike is actually changing direction. So I would guess that that would be looking at things like the lean angle versus the tire grip, so that dangerous situations are alerted to the rider before they get to the point where the rider can no longer control the machine. So the system triggers warning messages, which actually are on board to alert the test rider, but also for the proving ground control center as well, who can presumably step in and abort a test if they need to. So in a way, it's a very different approach to the Honda system, which is already working towards stepping in and taking control from the rider. This system actually works to figure out whether the bike is actually starting to exceed its design parameters, and then alert the rider to back off. And frankly, I'd feel a lot more comfortable with this kind of system that could monitor the bike and its environment and warn me before I got into trouble, rather than one that tries to get me out of trouble when I'm already in it. I think that's quite an interesting discussion point. I'd be absolutely fascinated to hear what other people think about this one. Right, I said this was a fairly short show today, so we're on to the final item, which is a discussion point. I'm going to be saying goodbye to the Honda CB400 Super Four. So if the idea of the assistive technology on the Honda I've just talked about is a bit too much for you, here are a couple of old school models that have now reached the end of their life. So let's just have a look at those. There we go. I'll just put those up full screen because I think they're worth looking at. They are the rather lovely Honda CB400 Super Four, that's the bike in the background there, the naked, and the CB400 Bull Door. Now, both of these machines have been in production since 1992, which is 30 years ago, and these final edition models actually mark the end of their long production run. And frankly, end of model runs are something I think we're going to see rather more of in the next few years. So in short, the new version appears in 3 different color schemes for the Japanese market. The bike features a 399cc liquid cooled inline 4 motor. It generates a maximum power output of around 55 horsepower. You get a peak torque of 39 Newton meters, and it's all delivered via a 6-speed gearbox. Wheels are standard 17-inch. The bike comes with dual channel ABS, and interesting, the machine features traditional forks up front and twin rear shocks. The latest bike weighs in at 190 kilograms, 420 pounds, which is fairly light by modern standards, and the tank holds a decent 18 litres or 4 imperial gallons. The bikes are Japan only models as far as I know. I don't think they're going to be exported anywhere. They have appeared in some Far Eastern countries, and they did make it to Australia and New Zealand for a short time. But in Japan, it seems that the Super 4 final edition will set you back around about £5,400 at current exchange rates, and the Bull Door final edition ramps the price up to £6,500. But I thought I'd talk a little bit more about these rather gorgeous machines today. Now, I've always had a soft spot for the bikes for a couple of reasons, really. I suppose the first is that my first proper bike after my 125 and 250, which I don't really consider proper bikes, was a rather lovely maroon and gold pinstripe Honda CB400 F2. That was the one, you may recall, where the pillion footrests weren't actually welded to the swing arm, which gave the pillion passenger a lot easier time, as they didn't bounce up and down every time you hit a bump. Now, the colour scheme on those bikes, I think it was an instant classic, and in my opinion, that lovely gold pinstriping has rarely been bettered on any bike. I took out a bank loan to buy that machine back in 1979. I took possession of it. It was 1 year old. It had done 1,032 miles only on the clock. I owned it for just about 3 years. I took it round Europe. I took it up to Scotland. Still a memorable trip, that one. I rode it to college, and I dispatched on it until it had done well over 80,000 miles. And then one day I loaned it to my brother. I can't quite remember the reason why, but the upshot of it was that he crashed it the first evening he had it, and he had it stolen on the second day. So at least the insurance payout allowed me to buy another identical bike, but it was never quite the same as that original first 404. So anyway, fast forward to the mid-90s. And I was just starting out as an instructor, and I spent 3 years working at Cinque Ports, based down in Kent at the town of Lydd. And I was one of the first direct access instructors in the country. Now, just before DAS came in, one of my trainees had just passed a test. And she asked me if I'd go along to one of the local bike shops and actually test ride a Honda CB1. Now, this wasn't a model I was actually familiar with, since it wasn't an official UK import. You couldn't buy them from Honda UK, but they came in via the grey import market, which was in full swing at that time. And these bikes were brought in to fill what was actually something of a hole in the Japanese model ranges. They really weren't catering for riders who wanted to step up to a sort of middle-sized bike, and in those days a 400 was a bit of a middle-sized bike. So the CB1 was a bit of a modern take on my old 404. The big difference, apart from 4 valves ahead, was the gear-driven cams, and that allowed that machine to rev quite happily to 12,500 RPM at the red line. Now, that was nothing like as high as some of the baby 250 4-cylinders that were also appearing at roughly that time. It was still pretty impressive. The looks of that bike were slightly odd. If you go and find a CB1, you'll find that it had sort of aluminium, sort of brushed aluminium panels, plates, in fact, where the side panels would normally be. And so it was slightly odd looking at the time. And even now, it still looks like something that could have emerged from a modern hipster workshop. But I could quite happily have found a place for that bike in my garage. It went pretty well, it stopped pretty well, it handled pretty well, and I loved it actually. Now, as it happens, she didn't buy it, but I have to admit I was seriously tempted at the time. Now, move on just a couple of months, and direct access was about to come in. So the school prepared by buying some bikes which were suitable for riders to take the test on. We got a bunch of brand new GS500s, but for some reason, the boss also got hold of a pair of the CB Super Fours. The model replaced the CB1. I'm not entirely sure what his logic was in getting the Hondas, since they were definitely heavier than the Suzukis. But we did get some spare seats, and what we did was we then cut the foam down in those, and so we could swap those seats in and out. And the bike actually did suit shorter riders quite well. Now, the Super Four, when it appeared, it had an updated CB1 engine. It lost the gear-driven cams. The cylinder block was tilted backwards, which allowed the bike to revert to an old school wraparound frame, and the monoshock at the rear end was also lost for a twin shock. So I guess it was a modern retro, one of the very first modern retros. Now, I got to ride those models actually quite a bit, and one thing that I can tell you about that engine is it is super smooth. It would pull away from tick over, quite literally. You could actually lift your hand off the throttle, and if you're careful, just ease the clutch out, and the bike would actually pull away without stalling. That's how smooth they are. Now, riders of bigger bikes often called the engine gutless, but yeah, I think that if you think that, you're missing the point of bikes like this. Not only can you use nearly all the power nearly all the time, try that on a bike with 160 horsepower. It's a motor that absolutely demands to be well ridden. You have to plan your use of the gearbox to exploit the revs if you're going to get on with it. You can't simply plonk this bike in a high gear and twist the throttle and exploit the fact it's a huge engine. It will accelerate so smoothly from low gear. As I just said, it will pull away from tick over. So if you are trundling around at 2000 RPM in top gear, which is probably about, if I remember right, just under 20 miles per hour, it'll accelerate. It will pull all the way up to the red line, but it will take an age to get there. But that did make it ideal, of course, for novice riders, because it really didn't matter which gear they were in. The bike would just run. The Suzuki GSs we had at the same time, if you got those into too high a gear at too low revs, they would actually either shake the chain to pieces or ultimately stall. It was pretty difficult to stall the Honda. But once you switch to a lower gear, you could ride it like an automatic. It had a 10,000 RPM rev range virtually. So you could just put that rev counter pretty much anywhere in the rev range and just literally twist the throttle and roll off the throttle and ignore the gearbox altogether. Okay, might not get there quite as quick as some bikes, but it was usable. And if you did want a bit of fun, the answer was simply to drop down a few gears. And then if you revved it, it just kept producing power. Way past my old 400's peak of 37 horsepower, claimed, probably more like 28 or 30 in real life. The Super Four passed that and just kept going. And it got to its 55 horsepower peak at 11,000 RPM. aural sculpture, to quote the Stranglers at that point. Top speed was around about 115, so you won't get blown away by a bike like this. Fuel consumption was somewhere in the low 60s if you didn't thrash the nuts off the thing. Now, over the next few years, since those very early 92 models appeared, Honda made some updates to the combustion chamber. They changed the exhaust, the ignition timing changed, but with one exception, that 399cc liquid cooled inline four engine stayed pretty much unchanged. The big change was in 1999 when Honda brought in the VTEC system. Now, this is the variable valve timing and lift electronic control system that Honda had also on the VFR 800. Interestingly, the VFR didn't get it till 2002. So Honda's VTEC on the CB400 Super Four was the first of the Hondas with variable valve timing, to my knowledge. Now, there are a few modern bikes around with the sort of VTEC style systems, but frankly, finding it on a bike that's more than 2 decades old, I dare say, will surprise a lot of younger riders. Essentially, even now, it's restricted to a few top-of-the-range machines. Now, I never got to ride one of the VTEC models, but in its original 1999 version, it apparently kicked in at 6,750 RPM. Below that threshold, one pair of the intake and exhaust valves were shut, so you effectively got a 2-valve engine. The benefit of that is that it speeds up the gas flow through the single valve that's left open, and that produces more torque than an equivalent 4-valve engine with more valve area. But once you're up to that magic figure where the engine is spinning quite freely, then the VTEC system kicks in, the other set of valves opens up, and you get all the benefits of high RPM performance from a 4-valve engine. So you basically get the best of both worlds. Now, it was a pretty basic system. Initially, it was the same one, as I just said, was found on the VTEC VFR 800, and I did ride one of those, and I would say that the VFR did gain probably as many critics as it gained fans, because the VTEC was a bit snatchy, it was a bit on off, and if you happen to be trying to cruise at the revs where the VTEC kicked in, it couldn't make up his mind whether it would open or close, and it would hunt between the two states. Personally, that didn't bother me. I just selected a different gear and rode in that. Anyway, it didn't take long before the VTEC system on the Super Four was rejigged, and that changed the way that the VTEC operated. I believe it opened and closed at different revs so that you didn't get that hunting between the two states. It also had an extra sensor. It monitored throttle position, not just engine speed and gear, and you also got fuel injection at that point, which allowed it to work more effectively with the VTEC, and at the same time ABS became an option. I think that was 2002. So as well as the half-fed version, the bikes always come in what I think is the rather gorgeous, this is probably my favorite bike, it's the ball door version. And I always thought that the half-fed bike looked rather special. The original Honda Bolt Door was named, of course, for the 24-hour endurance race in France, and that was launched back in the mid-1980s as a fully fed version of the VF 1000. Now, rather oddly, the half-fed Super Four, of course, bears more resemblance to the half-fed VF 1000F, which was known as the Interceptor in some markets. But whatever the naming confusion, what I can tell you is that both versions of the Super Four ooze quality. The fit and finish is right up there with the top of the range Honda models, and the quality of the components wasn't stinted either. For example, throughout its model run, the bike had floating front discs, something that you won't find on many bikes at all. And from 2002, the front brake calipers were actually lifted directly from the CBR 900RR, so it certainly stopped as well as any bike out there. Now, sadly, I think many current riders will probably never have ridden a 4-cylinder CC super bike like this, mini super bike, a pocket rocket, and I think because of the development of the electric motor and the looming end of the internal combustion engine, even if, as seems likely, the Japanese persist with hydrogen powered bikes, I think it's unlikely we'll see manufacturers actually committing resources to building another bike like this. Now, personally, I have always been a big fan of small revvy bikes. I generally prefer them to bigger, more powerful machines because you have to work to get the best out of them. Okay, maybe if I'm lugging a passenger and stuff around, it's not ideal. Maybe an easier to ride bike is a good answer, but for solo use, I'm quite happy riding something like this. And I've always believed that if riders actually didn't believe that there's a hype that bigger engines are better engines, they'd discover that they could stay decently entertained on a bike like this for quite a while. Now, the 3-decade model run of this bike really is something quite astonishing. I mentioned my CB400 4, the top of this piece, and that bike ran from 75 to 78, so just 3 years. The fact that the Super 4 lasted 10 times longer actually, I think, probably says something about the design of the engine in the first place, that it was cutting edge when it appeared, but also something about the pace of engine development, which was, of course, rampant through the 70s and 80s, but relatively stagnant since the 90s. Most of what you see on a modern motorcycle wouldn't look out of place on a sort of mid-90s or 2000s bike. Anyway, to sum up, 30 years after this particular model first appeared, I think it's obviously time to say goodbye to the two Super Fours, and I generally think they are modern classics. So, 2 final dates for your diary. Don't forget the next ride out. We're heading out towards Beaconsfield and Oxfordshire. That's Saturday, the 25th of June, 10 o'clock. Full details on the link in the header to the show. I have one extra space at the moment. I need to adapt or adjust the ticketing system for that, but there are 2 tickets, as I understand, available at the moment. I haven't actually checked this morning to see if anybody else has booked in, but as of last night, there were 2 tickets due to one cancellation. I will double check that. And finally, don't forget the first Wednesday in the month is the slot for my online talk series, and the next topic for that is going to be cornering and fixing cornering problems. And what I'll explain is how most rider training talks about how to corner properly, but hardly anybody actually discusses the reasons that riders make mistakes or how to get out of them when we find ourselves making them. So that's what we'll be looking at in this talk. So that's Wednesday, 6th of July at 8 p.m. and tickets for that are £5 from the usual place. All right, that is it for today. Thank you very much again for looking in, and I'll be back hopefully with a live show on Sunday. So again, from me, Kevin Williams of Survival Skills, that's it for my show today, and thanks again for looking in. Ride safe out there.